Money is that thing, that item that people use in one half of every exchange they make. So it's that one generally used facilitator of exchange or medium. But as you say, banks are able to create more claims to the gold coins than they have gold coins available. Subjectivity of value, people can change their minds since value is just personal.
The Culinary Libertarian Podcast, episode 46.
Hello, and welcome to the Culinary Libertarian Podcast, where the philosophy is free, but the food is on you.
Hello, folks. Dan Reed here, the Culinary Libertarian. Welcome back to the podcast. Happy to have you here. Happy to be here. Head over to my podcasts page, culinarylibertarian.com/podcasts, and there you can find all of my social media buttons, and the Facebook button will take you to my Eating Liberty Facebook group. These people are cooks and bakers and foodies, and sometimes they're the group of whom I ask questions about upcoming guests, just like today's guest. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel and support the show through Patreon, Bitcoin, or PayPal. For you coffee drinkers, you can pick up a coffee mug at my Cranky Without Coffee mug store, linked on the podcast page, and also get some muffin recipes to go with that coffee. You'll find a link to the Muffins e-cookbook, Foolproof Muffins, Recipes That Work Every Time, on the podcast page, and just trade me an email address, and then you can download the Muffin e-cookbook, and I'll send you a couple emails a week. Also, share episodes of the Culinary Libertarian Podcast on social media to your friends, and go out to your favorite podcatcher and rate and review the podcast. Just give me a 5-star rating and a positive review, and that will move the show up and let other people find it. My guest today is Jeffrey Herbener, PhD of Economics from Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, where he is also the chair. Jeff's focus is on monetary theory and policy, business cycles, and time preference. He has given lectures at the Mises Institute graduate seminars and has written The Meaning of Ludwig von Mises, Contributions in Economics, Sociology, Epistemology, and Political Philosophy, as well as edited The Pure Time Preference Theory of Interest, and has written journal articles and made various podcast appearances talking about economics and money. Hello, Jeff. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Culinary Libertarian Podcast.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Dan. Thanks for asking me on.
Well, it's my pleasure as well, because I'm pretty excited to speak to a for real economist instead of those of us who pretend we are. And for people like me in my audience, I think I probably reach some libertarians, but I designed this podcast also to really reach cooks or foodies, people who just either like cooking or like eating or like doing both. And we're probably not economists. So what I want to do is just as real sort of third grade bare bones, just some understanding of some of the real basic stuff. And I've listened to some of your podcasts, and it seems to, well, we'll get there in a minute, but there's a vocabulary problem, which we'll talk about in a minute, that I think sort of turns people's eyes just kind of gaze over. So before we get there, let's just start, if we can, with a very basic explanation of what is money and how does money different from currency, and then how is that different from capital?
Sure. And I might say on the terminology point, it's a very astute comment that you made. In defense, though, of the economists, it does require, economic theory does require a rather technical set of terms to make fine distinctions that are necessary in advanced economic theory. And Um, at least on the good side, that's where the terminological problem comes in. But you're very correct on a kind of basic level. This terminology it makes things opaque, and we don't need that. These basic concepts are hopefully pretty straightforward, and things that we have our own experience with, just as human beings engaged in normal social life. So, any case, to get to your definitions, money we define in economics as the general medium of exchange. By this, we mean that money is that thing, that item that people use in one half of every exchange they make. So you take a job and you sell your labor services, and you get paid not in cookies or apples or horses or some such thing, but in money. And so does everyone else. And you go to the grocery store and you buy a bag of groceries, and you don't pay in live chickens or in lectures in economics or in culinary advice. You pay in money, and so does everybody else. So it's that one generally used facilitator of exchange or medium of exchange. And then we make this distinction that you cited in distinction between money and currency. So currency, typically the way this term is used, currency is a claim to money. So to take the best historical case, under a gold standard where a gold coin is money itself, and people are using it in exchange when they buy things or when they sell things, currency is a paper claim to the gold coin. And so we have things like the Treasury certificates of the United States, or other such claims, banknotes of the 19th century, and things of this sort. Now, the third term that you mentioned is even trickier to work with. There's a lot of ambiguity in the use of the word capital, but the most basic sense in which we can think of capital is the market price of durable goods. Sometimes this is identified as capital value to distinguish it from other kinds of capital. So, in other words, it's the market value of your assets. And this, of course, is used by everybody in again, normal social interactions, normal economic activity, to account for what's happening to the change in their total wealth or the total value of their assets when they acquire durable goods or sell off durable goods. You buy a house, and what's the market value of this house? And that's its capital value, the amount that's adding to your wealth.
So it seems, at least of the three, capital is the most likely to be subject to, two more terms, inflation and deflation. So if you buy a house, and lots of homeowners saw this in 2008, well, I paid $400,000 for my house, but now my house isn't worth that. So now, any talk of economics is open to just scores of rabbit holes, and I'm trying to avoid as many of them as possible, because every one of them can be an interesting conversation. But for the people who are just trying to figure out what some of this stuff is, I think I want to avoid the difference between value, because value is subjective, and someone's going to say, what does that mean? But that will have to be for another conversation, perhaps. Any talk about money seems to lead to a conversation about a bank. And to her slight credit, AOC seemed to be testing the idea of the necessity of the Fed, which also is another rabbit hole. So the idea of money creation is a challenging one to me, because if currency is a paper claim to money, and there's gold, well, I suppose gold could be created by going into the earth and mining it and finding more. I don't think you can make more. We're not alchemists. But for a simple explanation, how does a bank or a central bank or the Fed create this thing out of thin air? How is this possible?
Yeah, this is a really excellent question, and let me start with the reference that you made to gold. We do this in economic theorizing in order to have a a goalpost to measure by when we talk about different monetary systems. It's very helpful to have a set kind of an arrangement in order to compare it and contrast it to what we have in the world today. And we know this is, of course, an historical example. So, as you said, if we have gold coin as money, then we know exactly how, in economic theory, how we think about the production of money. It's just produced in the same way that everything else is produced, according to profit and loss. So in every production process, say smartphones, the cost of production of buying all the inputs and then assembling them into the phone and through various steps of production throughout the economy. And then the phone is sold to the customer and generates a certain amount of revenue. And as long as revenues cover costs, well, then production is viable. But as you said before, in the subjectivity of value, people can change their minds, since value is just personal, about how much they're willing to pay to buy certain things. And so the revenue streams can change. So we might give up our smartphones, or we might move from less technically advanced ones to more technically advanced ones, being willing to pay more money. And then resources will shift. So entrepreneurs will just shift into those things that they anticipate will be more profitable. And it's you and I, consumers at large, who make these things more or less profitable. So under a gold money system, money production conforms to these same rules of the market production as any other good. So we don't have to worry about some sort of weird exceptional features of money production. But as you mentioned, once we move to a system like we have now, a fiat money system, or even a banking system, where the banks can be fractional reserve, then we have money production on a different basis. At least with the banks, money substitute production on a different basis. So let's start with that case. Suppose we have gold as money, like in the 19th century. In the U.S., so we had gold coins as money, and then banks are able to produce these claims to money. Let's say they're just physical banknotes, so we call this currency, or you have the United States Treasury producing these physical banknotes, these certificates. And these are just redemption claims for gold coin. So a bank prints a $10 banknote, and on the face of it, they put, this note is redeemable for $10 in gold at any office of our bank. And that's why people accept the money substitute in commerce in lieu of coin itself. It has certain convenience in carrying, or let's say instead of banknotes, these were just checking account balances. The safety and convenience of swiping your debit card is better than hauling around gold coins. So people are apt to use them as long as they accept the validity of the redemption claim. But as you say, banks are able, at least under certain legal systems, are able to create more claims to money, more claims to the gold coins than they have gold coins available. They're able to do this as long as it's undetectable, or as long, again, as the law shields the bank from redemption claims that people might make. And this, of course, because banks can do this, they can issue many more claims to money than they have money. This is the reason why there are runs on banks. So clearly, if we had a monetary system like the Amsterdam banks of the 1600s, where they kept gold coin as reserve and then issued banknotes for customers in lieu of the use of these gold coins, but they issued banknotes only in the exact same amount that they held gold coins, then there could not be adverse bank runs on these banks. In our system, where there are fractional reserves that are held by banks, then there can be adverse bank runs. Once again, you raise the crucial question, why do people put up with the system or accept the system? And here the answer is mainly legal impositions. So there's typically a government arrangement that brings the banks into a system so that they don't compete against each other by presenting banknotes of a competing bank for redemption, and then run on that bank and destroy that bank. If we have fiat paper where the government simply prints money into existence, as you mentioned, this too requires legal protection. And so there are typically legal tender laws that require persons to accept the government's money in payment of debt. There are legal disabilities that are placed upon alternative currencies like gold or other private currencies. We're going to see perhaps in the near future some crackdown on cryptocurrencies if they start to get a bigger foothold in the use of a medium of exchange.
It sounds like a good business to be in when you are in control of what is legally allowed to be accepted as money, and then are the only person allowed to print what's legally accepted as money. Well, that's the catbird seat, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, this is why all governments monopolize this production. Even back in the Middle Ages, where there was no paper currency in Western countries, the sovereign would monopolize this function of money production because it was lucrative. And back in those days, the prince would debase the coins since there wasn't paper that could be issued as claims to the coins. And this too was a lucrative business for the state.
So the idea of fractional reserve banking, and I sort of have listened to Bob Murphy enough to understand that let's say the bank has $100, they're going to lend 10 people $100, and the idea is that when these people are paying back these loans, the bank is getting the money back, plus they're getting a profit, and everything works fine until everything doesn't work fine. And so I think to me, there's two things connected here, and maybe I'm wrong, but if they're doing fractional reserve banking, well, two things: is that leading actually to inflation, and that's the first question. The second question maybe is in the process of this money further down the line, but if the banks are making money, well, or fiat currency, it seems to me that this is not valued equally or the same. So the first person who gets that money is getting more value for that paper dollar than the 10th person down the line. Can you explain how that's the case?
Sure. Well, okay, so let's take them in reverse order. Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, this is a feature of any monetary system, even under a gold standard. There'll be people who obtain the new money that's produced first in the process. In that case, it would be the customers of the gold producers. And of course, they get to go out and buy things with this new money before prices have been bid up throughout society, if there's enough additional money for everyone to have. And so there's a wealth transfer that's involved. And this wealth transfer, of course, is nothing unique to gold money production or silver money production or commodity money production. This occurs in the production of anything. So if you're if you're an entrepreneur and you're running a business and you're producing something that's profitable and selling well, then this is moving resources into that production, and income is being redistributed, and wealth is being created in all of these processes. But when banks just artificially increase the money, their money substitutes checking accounts and banknotes that they just create out of thin air or print up, and there's no real additional production of goods, then this redistribution of wealth is actually a negative sum game. Actually, wealth will overall in the process will not just be redistributed to the first obtainers of the new money, but actually destroyed. Take the case of, let's say, the government, our Federal Reserve. prints up money to buy treasury debt that the government has issued to make expenditures on war materials. And then this shifts resources, because it's now profitable to produce arms and so on. This shifts resources out of other things and into armaments that have less value to people in society as expressed by their demands for things than the other things that can't be produced because the resources have moved. And so these effects are well known by economists. This, in fact, is the source of the business cycle. These effects of newly produced money creating a new or different pattern of production, and this different pattern of production proves to be less satisfactory than the original, except again when we have a market-produced money.
So when you say resources, it's not just, well, we'll use the term colloquially, it's not just money resources, but in the case of saying the building tanks, resources also include, now there's labor for the tanks, there's the raw materials of the iron or steel. I don't actually know the difference, but if all that stuff and all those people are going to build tanks, well, then now those people and that stuff is not available to build cars or skyscrapers or razor blades. So is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. The economists like to say that money production is not neutral to the real production process in the economy, that is, the production of real goods and services. It alters the use of resources, and in a way that's not favorable to the overall satisfaction of people's preferences and demands.
Okay, well, this seems a good spot to sort of go back to the idea of the vocabulary that economists speak. Things like aggregate demand, utility, fiduciary. You mentioned money substitutes, inflation, deflation, and there's more. But I did make the observation that these probably confuse more than help just general consumers who feel overwhelmed with. It's not Orwellian, but it's a vernacular that they don't understand. So speaking for myself, it wasn't all that long ago that I knew next to nothing about economics, and I'm probably still sort of plebeian on that scale. So the question I want to know, and maybe this is hard to answer, how can we use this money information, that money is a commodity, how can our daily lives be made more informed by understanding this?
Well, I guess there's certainly one thing that comes to mind, which is that if we want to be involved in the processes of improving society, then we have to be able to understand, we have to comprehend and understand how society works. So if we want reform of the various things that we think have gone wrong in society, the first step is to grasp what the causes of these bad effects are. And I would say we can generalize this principle, of course, to any particular social malady that we see. We need to be able to grasp what are the causes that are generating this effect if we want to work toward a solution. And so this would be the first step. It starts with learning and discovering how the world actually works so that we can be better informed and we can think out action in our own lives on various scales that will provide solutions. I'll give you just one. I'm not saying this is a good solution, but one area in the realm of money where this has been tried. This is I think somewhat of a tradition in small towns in Vermont, where in order to help local businesses and to avoid the broader monetary system that they think is impinging upon local business activity, the town issues script, and they use the script as a local currency. And and again, I'm not saying this is this is a great solution. It just sort of indicates that at least they're thinking about what the problem is and how to sidestep it. They realize there's some sort of problem with money, and they're trying to come up with a solution, even though that might not be as effective a solution as we could come up with if we thought it through carefully. A similar thing, of course, is taking place among libertarians with respect to cryptocurrency. So they think that they can opt out of the system and sidestep it and set up their own institutional structures that can't be impacted by the power of the state. And again, I'm not pronouncing one way or the other on experiments like this. I'm just saying that unless we grasp what the problem is, it's unlikely that we would ever come up with a solution that is effective.
I think most, not even necessarily cynical libertarians would identify the problem immediately as the government with a giggle and a quip, but they may not be far from the case. I saw a post somebody put up on a Facebook page where they were sent a letter from the IRS stating that we have reason to believe that you have cryptocurrency, and now no matter where on the planet that cryptocurrency is, it is subject to our taxation. So I think we've discovered the problem, but that's that's also another show.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was hedging about that as a solution. Yeah. A similar thing happened. I alluded to this a minute ago. The government has done a similar thing with legal disabilities against the use of gold. So there have been entrepreneurs who have attempted to start up their own gold money production or silver money production. And the problem with this is that the state will tax the capital gain on every transaction you make in coins because they consider coins commodities. So imagine having to keep track of every time you spend a gold coin, what its actual purchasing power is, so that you can pay taxes on any appreciation of the gold coin as you go along. I mean, the paperwork alone would be insurmountable.
Utah, I think, I don't know what it's called, but I think Utah has created its own gold paper currency. And I saw a picture. I don't remember the word for it, but it was interesting anyway. And that was on a libertarian page. But politicians seem to politic beyond any reasonable measure of their specific constituency to control them. We average Joe types can't deficit spend, and certainly libertarians know more than enough about deficit spending to prosperity has been shown well to fail. So you mentioned the business cycle. So properly identified, that would be the Austrian Business Cycle Theory. What can people who don't even know what that is take from that and apply to their daily lives?
Okay, well, I guess one thing they can grasp perhaps most readily about the Austrian Business Cycle Theory is that it provides an explanation for all depressions and downturns. So it's the go-to explanation for why there was a Great Recession or why there was a Great Depression. And if one grasps the basic principles of the explanation, then it at least inoculates one from various fallacies about what the cause of these things is. Like deregulation of the financial system or some other mainstream attempt to explain this. So I think that is certainly of some benefit to people, even if they don't grasp the theory in its completeness. At least they can have a sense of how it generates, how the system of the government's money generates the boom-bust cycle. The other thing is a little bit more prosaic. It's just if you can grasp the way in which the business cycle plays out as an effect of monetary inflation and credit expansion, it's helpful in adjusting your own personal finances. So, for example, we seem to be moving toward the end of a very strong stock market boom. And if you're just somewhat conversant with what average returns are in the stock market, and you look at what's going on now, well, you know that's somewhat helpful in grasping what you would see as a trigger for the next stock correction. And so this is, I think, of practical help to people. Maybe even especially entrepreneurs in running their business and anticipating what the conditions are going to be in the near future when there's a correction.
And I think I might get the name wrong, but I think Mark Thornton wrote a book about that, the skyscraper course. And there is, while the timing, no one can ever know the specifics. The Austrian Business Cycle Theory does provide a predictability about the events throughout the cycle, whereas without it, lots of people are just like, what do you mean my stock is worth money? What happened? How could this be? So I think at least being aware of it is something that's helpful for people to say there is a pattern here, and we can know what the next step is. The thing that we can't know is the when, because no one can know that.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So that takes more insight, special insight that only certain people seem to possess in great quantity.
Without getting too partisan, and as we get closer to 2020, and I didn't watch the debates last night because I already know what they're going to say, more and more and more. The economic illiteracy and is more than I can stand. We're going to hear more of that same thing, increasingly idiotic claims about plans to fix the economy. What might a politician say that sets off alarm bells for you, and what is alarming about that?
Oh my.
We only have a half hour left.
Yeah, almost everything they say sets off alarm bells, but you're right, there's degrees. I think right now what is most alarming to me is that there doesn't seem to be any sense of even recognition that the growing deficits that are being run might lead to a problem. There just doesn't seem to be. Trump is completely oblivious to this. Of course, none of the Democrats talk about this. So this seems to be extremely problematic. Maybe they're behind the scenes discussions of some more level-headed politicians about the problem of the debt and the deficit. But as far as we can tell from the outside, it appears that it's not even on their radar. That they're more interested in Russiagate and impeaching Trump and healthcare and climate change and whatever else, and are paying no attention whatsoever to the government's finances and the role of the Fed and monetary inflation credit expansion in this process of supporting this gigantic debt and the huge, as you mentioned before, the huge wealth transfer that's involved in all of this.
Well, so this is going to be clunky, but I just had an idea, and perhaps part of the reason their focus is where their focus is the financial attention it gets them. So if AOC was talking about how we have to cut back on spending to manage the deficit, well, that's a snooze fest. Nobody cares about that. We talk about my Coke can might ruin the planet. Oh, well, my goodness, let me send you $5. So it seems to me on a large scale, there is a pretty good explanation of market forces at work.
Yeah, well, I would agree with this. It's in no politician's interest to speak openly about this, or at least not no broad support for speaking openly about this. But I wouldn't, it does seem though that this is a different phenomena than in national politics and what used to occur. And maybe, again, this is ancient history now, but certainly these sorts of issues were live issues in politics, say just 100 years ago, certainly in the 19th century. So it does make one wonder why why this has gone off the radar screen of the politicians. No longer an issue to speak about monetary affairs or to speak about budgetary affairs. I guess we have more, I don't know, interesting things to debate. Maybe it's that we become so wealthy that we think that this is not an issue anymore. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not sure either, but I'm possibly jaded enough to think that there's a big nefarious reason for it, and I think that I'd prefer not to know what that nefarious reason is, which is at my detriment, of course. So I have a couple of Facebook groups. One of them is an Eating Liberty Facebook group, and a couple of chef groups. So I asked them, those people, some questions, saying I'm going to be speaking with an economist. What questions would you like to have answered? So I have a couple here, and these can be kind of quick. Some of them are, well, one of them is a personally reflective one, which I think is interesting. But what key piece of advice would you give the uninformed when it comes to dealing with money?
Oh boy. Does this I can interpret the question, I guess. So I'll take that question. To me, the most straightforward way to think about that question is in personal terms. So here, I guess the advice is that you have to think about the different scenarios of how the future might play out with respect, say, to your investments or with respect to the income stream that you anticipate from various careers and so on. So when you're dealing with money, at least on a personal level, dealing with your income and with your expenditures and so on, you need to think out how the future will be realized. And here, I mentioned one example of this already. We seem to be pretty near the top of a stock boom. It's probably not a good time to invest heavily in the stock market. So what are the alternatives? Well, then you have to think out how you anticipate the correction to take place. Will it affect bonds? Will it affect real assets? Should you invest in land or in other hedges against inflation? Is that what we are to expect? And so on and so forth. Again, this is a very difficult a task, but if you're concerned about personal finances, it seems to me this is the proper framework to apply to the problem. You just have to think out how you believe the future scenarios will be, which one will be likely. Will we have an inflationary spiral? Will we have a stock collapse and a depression? And then what would you do under those circumstances?
So diversify.
Yeah, diversification, it depends on what you think the future is going to be like. So if you think it's a 90% probability that we're going to have hyperinflation, then you don't want to diversify. You want to be in real goods, right? But if you think, well, I'm only 50-50, it's going to be hyperinflation or it's going to be depression, well, then you want to diversify because you just don't have any better option, really, than to hedge against things that you think are equally likely or, probable in your own estimation.
Would you recommend borrowing money even if you have the cash to pay for the goods in full? Now, this doesn't distinguish between buying a washing machine or a house.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I would say it might depend on other circumstances that aren't stated in the question, but I would say not knowing those, just as a general rule, I would say it's always better to pay cash. Again, the crucial unstated condition is whether you think rates of return on the money that you would have invested are greater or less than the interest rate you'd pay in order to borrow the money. But it's always, other things equal, it's always better to carry less debt. Again, unless you expect the hyperinflation to come, and then, of course, you want to be heavily in debt. So it does depend on other conditions, but I would say in a world that's going to play out pretty much like the last 20 years have played out, it's probably better to stay out of debt if you have the cash to pay. But again, the crucial caveat is whether or not you can take the funds that you would pay in cash and invest them in something that would generate a return significantly greater than the debt you pay, the interest that is on the debt that you pay.
If you could go back in time, what would you do over when it comes to your personal finance?
That actually is a pretty easy one. I was just thinking about this actually the other day. So when I first started, it was in the early 1980s. I first started my academic career. And looking back, of course, what I would have done is I would have invested all of my retirement package in stock instead of, say, splitting it 50-50 between stocks and bonds. Because from the early 80s until the early 2000s, we had the biggest stock market boom in the history of the country. And I would be much, much wealthier now if I would have invested all of those retirement payments into my 401ks and so on in stock instead of splitting it.
So if only we had the DeLorean for Back to the Future.
Yeah, that's right.
So the last one from the listeners or viewers or readers, which is more important, income or personal budget? And so that's interesting because I had a long conversation with this person about that answer, but I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah, boy. Yeah, again, I would say, there can be conditions under which I would go one way or the other, but I would say as a general rule, it's budget. As a general rule, you can, if you're willing to keep your manage your expenditures, then you can live under most any, reasonable income. Most people who are not super wealthy, but just sort of getting to the wealthy stage, aren't necessarily in any better financial position in terms of their investments and so on than other people. Because they can't budget. Expenditures rise to meet income, and if you can control expenditures, it's a matter of self-control. You can control expenditures, then even with modest income, you can build a sizable financial wealth over a lifetime of earning.
Well, my first response to this person was, it depends on what your income is. If you're making $50,000 a month,
Mm-hmm.
I think your
it's true. You're absolutely right.
is secondary, so you're not going to go buy 2 Lamborghinis.
Yeah, absolutely.
If your income is $2,000
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
month, well, now we have another problem. And so, and this is, I'm sure somebody has paid attention to this, but there seems to be you're older than I am, but not probably by a lot. So from the 80s, and even I remember as a kid in the 70s, I don't think there was as much stuff. So conspicuous consumption was, I think, really the thing out of the 50s, when the middle class became a thing, maybe earlier than that. So even in the 70s and 80s, we weren't inundated with endless amounts of things, although we had the pet rock. But now, and maybe there isn't actually more stuff, but because we have these handheld computers and immediate access to everything, and we can get it from Amazon 2 days from today, it seems like just the world is available now, and all that you have to do is push a button and buy it. Well, that has impacted on people's desires for immediate gratification, which is probably a whole other book for somebody. But all these things lead up to a society that seems not to have the skills to, and the economists would say, low time preference. We don't want to save for the thing. We want it right now, and budget be damned. And consequences, schmonsequences, who cares? And that seems to be, I think, a really big part of this puzzle, but I don't know how you fix that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The macro data bears this out. So Americans in the 21st century have been saving somewhere close to a little bit under 5% of their incomes. And even back in the 70s, this was more like 15%. And back before World War II, it was more like 20%. And so you see this steady downward saving propensity that Americans have. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a cultural. It sort of feeds on itself. It's kind of a feedback mechanism where this easy access that you point out tends to break down self-control and break down the lower time preference that people have toward deferring their gratification and to obtain something better in the future. And it creates an ethos of self-absorption and so on that's not healthy. I'm not saying that, of course, all Americans succumb to this, but as a society, this has been a definite trend over the last, certainly century.
Right, well, so this is a good point. Talk for a minute about why savings is important beyond the obvious ability to deal with emergency situations, but saving money in, well, okay, we'll go with the bank. Start with saving of money, having some reserves. How is that money in the bank helping? If everyone's doing it and more people start doing it, what's changing about the economy? What's changing about the system if we have more savings?
Right. So the savings that we provide, and economists here, when we talk about saving, we mean that we're postponing our consumption. We're delaying it into the future. We're showing this kind of self-control or low time preference, however you want to say this, that people exhibit. And this frees up resources then to shift toward longer, more productive production processes. And so new technologies can be implemented, more and better capital goods as aids to production can be produced. That take longer periods to produce than we would if we saved less and therefore had fewer resources devoted to those things and more resources devoted to the more direct production of consumer goods. So this is a crucial factor, perhaps the crucial factor, in explaining economic progress or economic growth over time. And again, the data is very telling on this point, where we see this process of economic progress beginning in the so-called Industrial Revolution around 1800 or in the mid-18th century, perhaps, and steadily moving up to the present. But the people who have been saving through that period have changed. So for the last 30 years or so, it's been mainly Asians, mainly Chinese, who have saved tremendously. And since we have world markets, world capital markets, where the saving can be invested anywhere in the world, the standards of living in America continue to go up because we're relying on the low time preference of other people in other places of the world. Whereas before, say in the 18th and 19th century, it was English, and then Americans by being part of the English system that had the lowest time preferences, and others in Europe in the 19th century. So this is a crucial factor in creating the standards of living and then the rising standards of living that we've enjoyed over time.
I'm getting a little bit of feedback on your side.
I've got a mower running outside. It's not me. I'm at the college and somebody's mowing the lawn outside. Yeah, I just started up.
Well, that was not nice of him. Mean guy.
Yeah. I can't even yell at him to stop.
Okay.
I'm on the third floor.
I see. All right. Well, all right then. Okay. So I know there are some resources. There are some authors we didn't mention, but there are some heavy hitters in the author world. So there's Mises and there's Rothbard, and I heard you speaking to Jeff Deist about the theory of money and credit and how you were kind of impressed that your students were carrying it around and talking about it as opposed to some of the other more academic tomes. So people who find this information interesting and say, wow, I want to learn more about this. So where can they go? Obviously, we'll say the theory of money and credit. I'll put a link on that for today's show notes page, which is going to be culinarylibertarian.com/46. What about Rothbard's What Has Government Done with Our Money? Is that a good place to start?
Yeah, that's an excellent, very accessible work. Rothbard, as usual, is very lucid, and even those who aren't conversant in economics can usually learn quite a bit from anything that Rothbard's written.
I find I've listened to some of his lectures, and so when I read his work, I hear his voice, but he kind of writes how he speaks. So that's good because he's pretty accessible. He's got I enjoy his humor. All right.
Yeah, he's excellent. Absolutely. Let's say, there's some good introductory treatments of economics that cover the more broad areas that we've been looking at as opposed to narrowly money. You mentioned Bob Murphy before. He's got this book, Lessons for the Young Economist.
I have read part of that. It's
which
fantastic.
So that's a good introduction for your listeners to economics more broadly.
Okay. I want to, because I really liked your Speak with Jeff, I'm going to put a link to that for the talk about theory of money and credit for people to listen to, because I thought that was a really excellent primer, and someone's going to correct me, it's primer, for getting into and understanding more about this subject. So I do have one more small series of questions for you, because after all, this is a food show. And so this is real quick, kind of a short answer, but I find these kind of fun. Of the 5 flavors, sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami, which one do you enjoy the most?
Oh, it's bitter, definitely. I'm a big coffee drinker.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, definitely bitter.
What's your favorite food?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's too hard. It changes every time I discover something. So
What's your favorite food this week?
This week, Kluski.
Oh, okay. What's your least favorite food?
Oh my goodness, least favorite. Boy, that's another problem. There's not too much I don't like. I got to be careful of that. Let's see. Least favorite is probably. I don't know. I'm drawing a blank. I like too many foods.
Okay.
I try not to dwell on the downside.
Oh, what a good attitude.
Optimist, I guess.
What gets you excited?
I think what gets me excited is because I'm a teacher. It's when the light bulb goes on in the students' eyes. It's that moment of enlightenment when you've learned something. Both as me when I learn something and when I see this in my students.
I taught culinary for a couple of years. I know exactly that moment, and it's just very rewarding to see that the aha moment. Yeah, no, it's good.
That's it.
What turned you off?
Oh boy, political correctness. I guess is the biggest one right now. Yeah.
What sound do you love?
Almost anything by Bach.
Notwithstanding lawnmowers, what sound do you hate?
Almost all modern music, I guess.
Wow. Well, you and
sorry.
are not going to get along.
Well, that's the way it goes.
Fair enough. And what is your favorite food indulgence?
I would say it's one of my wife's wonderful cobblers with vanilla ice cream on top.
Nice. Well, in there we share something, although it would be my wife loving one of my cobblers, and for her it would be peach cobbler.
I see.
Well, she's a Southern girl, so peaches are the thing. But, you don't have to be from the South to love a peach.
Absolutely.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for your time today. And I know we had a budget of time, and so we're getting close to that. Do you have a website or something that you want to let people know they can find you, or where they can find your work?
Yeah, at work. So at Grove City College, so we have a Facebook a page for our department. They might visit that. They can find that. Just Google search economics at Grove City College, and that should pop up.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll put a link to that also on the show notes page. And it has been my pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your help.
Well, thanks for having me on. This has been a really great time.
Well, good. Well, that makes me happy. All right, folks, that's going to do it. Money and economics can be frustrating at least. Jeff mentioned doing research to know what might happen, But where to go to find such things? As it happens, Jeff has some content to get you started. You can find Jeff's work, 3 courses, at Liberty Classroom using my affiliate link, culinarylibertarian.com/biteback. In addition to Jeff's courses, you can find courses from historians Brian McClanahan, Tom Woods, and Kevin Gutzman, as well as a course on sci-fi, liberty, and dystopia, Laura Ingalls Wilder's literary genius, and logic, which is sorely needed today. You can find the banner to Liberty Classroom, as well as the links to the books mentioned and Jeff's contact at culinarylibertarian.com/46. After we stopped recording, Jeff did have an answer to his least favorite food, grits. Let's just grant him that as his one deviation. I also asked him a question I didn't ask on air, which was, if the Fed just prints money almost on demand, why not just print a $22 trillion note and end the debt? Of course, that's silly, but it does really offer a chance to examine the concept of debt and obligations and, another term, debt repudiation. So, to help with the last part, I'm going to add a link to the article which Jeff sent me about debt repudiation, and it's an easy read. It's also a good way to understand the difference between public debt and private debt. Have a good week, and I'll see you soon. Music for the Culinary Libertarian podcast is provided by Matthew Bankert at mattbankert.com.